A man surrounded by police files detailing history's most disturbing domestic case. A silent regular in the dark corners of London's notorious underground clubs, and a VIP guest on the private island of Jeffrey Epstein's criminal empire. Yet the world reveres him as a secular saint, a symbol of absolute triumph over tragedy, who mapped the cosmos and received global glory. The man holding these two violently opposing faces is Stephen Hawking. Why did a mind so vast sink into a black hole of dark secrets and profound moral fracture? Behind the global mythos lies a grueling domestic reality. The true cost of his survival was paid by those closest to him, through silent emotional manipulation, a ruthless exercise of power within his inner circle, and a desperate pursuit of control that ultimately fractured his own family. Every tragedy is driven by a fatal weakness. For Stephen Hawking, his brilliant mind masked a profound unspoken terror of his own physical powerlessness. The diagnosis of motor neuron disease in the early 1960s was a 2-year death sentence. Up to this point, everything in his life was still relatively normal for a bright, arrogant Oxford student. Then his body began to fail. Faced with the abyss, he developed a ruthless, uncompromising demand for absolute control over his immediate environment. He could not control his muscles, so he learned to control people. This established dynamic of manipulation laid the groundwork for his eventual ruin. In 1965, Jane Wilde married him, fully expecting to be a widow within a few years. She abandoned her own academic trajectory. She became his nurse, his voice, and his protector. She absorbed the entire shock wave of his collapsing body. But Hawking fiercely refused outside medical help to protect his fragile pride. He demanded that Jane maintain the illusion of a normal household. When she tried to discuss the devastating reality of his illness, he used his silence as a weapon to shut her down. He retreated deep into his intellect, leaving the grueling physical debris of his life for his wife to clean up. The dynamic shifted dramatically in 1985. A severe bout of pneumonia resulted in a tracheotomy, saving his life but permanently destroying his natural voice. He lost his total dependence on Jane as his interpreter. An engineer named David Mason adapted a computer program that gave Hawking his iconic electronic voice. Armed with this technology, he published A Brief History of Time. Global fame arrived like a tidal wave. Wealth poured in. He was surrounded by a team of nurses who treated him not as a difficult patient, but as a living deity. He craved this uncritical adoration. But the plot twist here is staggering in its cruelty. Hawking used the very machine engineered by David Mason to seduce Mason's own wife, Elaine. By Christmas 1990, the fortress of his first marriage broke. Hawking left the family home, moving out with his nurse. Jane Wilde was left behind, 30 years of her youth wrung out and discarded. Hawking subsequently erected an impenetrable wall of silence between himself and his 3 children. He traded the complex, grounded reality of a devoted family for the echo chamber of a sycophant. He married Elaine in 1995, believing he had engineered the perfect life of absolute control and endless worship. But when you hand someone the keys to your survival purely because they feed your ego, you hand them the power to destroy you. The Cambridge house quickly turned into a site of profound physical torment. By the early 2000s, horrifying medical reports and testimonies from terrified former nurses began to surface. The physical manifestations of his vulnerability were grotesque. He suffered a severely fractured wrist. He arrived at the hospital with deep gashes to his face and a severed lip. According to multiple journalistic investigations, he was once left abandoned in his wheelchair under the blazing summer sun until he suffered severe heat stroke. He was routinely denied basic dignity. The genius who commanded the respect of world leaders was being battered and humiliated in his own bedroom. In 2004, Cambridge police opened a formal investigation into alleged systemic abuse. Detectives arrived armed with medical files and testimonies from former nurses. Yet, instead of confirming the suspicions, Hawking actively stonewalled the authorities. When questioned, he categorically refused to make a complaint. He fiercely defended his abuser and threatened legal action against the press. His pride was his fatal flaw. To admit he was a battered victim would destroy the untouchable myth of his public persona. He chose the hell of physical abuse over the humiliation of public pity. Without his cooperation, the police were forced to close the file. Trapped in a deeply toxic home, his suppressed desire sought controversial outlets. He began frequenting London's VIP gentlemen's clubs. Peter Stringfellow, a notorious club owner, noted that when asked about physics, the professor simply requested the company of the dancers. He sat motionless for hours in dark corners, seeking environments of pure transactional power. In these clubs, his fame shielded his behavior, and his money bought him the illusion of control. He was becoming dangerously comfortable in exclusive, consequence-free zones, surrounded by men who operated in the shadows. In March 2006, Hawking attended a scientific conference funded by Jeffrey Epstein. Archival records and photographs place him on Little Street James, a private island now infamous for its horrific trafficking operations. Hawking attended a barbecue on the island. He took a customized submarine tour of the seabed, paid for entirely by Epstein. There are no allegations that Hawking participated in any sexual crimes, but his mere presence is a devastating blow to his moral standing. The situation was grotesque in its absolute, deafening hypocrisy. A mind capable of fathoming the infinite looked the other way, dining and diving with a prolific human trafficker to maintain his VIP treatment. He traded the immense moral weight of his name to provide a shield of respectability for a monster. He understood the laws of gravity, but he willfully ignored the basic laws of human decency for the sake of luxury and access. Stephen Hawking spent his life mapping the event horizons of black holes, but he could never escape the black hole of his own life. The devoted wife he discarded, the horrifying physical wounds he covered up in stubborn silence, the misguided journeys into a world of compromised ethics and shadowy figures. He is the tragic product of an unimaginable physical prison and a deeply fragile ego. His legacy is a massive intellectual triumph, but it is equally a heavy moral debt. If it weren't for the blinding halo of his intellect, society might have intervened in his darkest hours, or held him accountable for his most selfish choices. History records him as a genius, but a brilliant mind does not guarantee a brilliant character. When the equations are erased and the applause fades, there are no heroes and no villains. There is only the unvarnished truth. The illness did not forge his immense ego. It merely weaponized an existing arrogance. When a 17-year-old Stephen Hawking arrived at Oxford in the autumn of 1959, he was already a fiercely proud prodigy who viewed academic discipline with open contempt. He was bored by the curriculum and openly dismissive of his professors. By his own later admission, he spent barely an hour a day on his studies during his 3 years at Oxford. He was acutely aware that he possessed an intellect far superior to the men grading his papers, and he wore that superiority like a tailored suit. He demanded to be recognized as exceptional without putting in the foundational labor. These early Oxford years provided the first clear physical manifestation of how he preferred to exercise power. Hawking was physically slight, unathletic, and entirely unsuited for the brutal, demanding sports of the British upper class. Yet he desperately craved the center of attention and the authority of leadership. He found the perfect vehicle for this psychological need on the river. He became the coxswain for the college rowing team. As the coxswain, seated motionless at the stern, he dictated the physical output of superior athletes. He barked unrelenting orders, completely exempt from the burning muscle fatigue and physical exhaustion he demanded from his crew. He loved this dynamic. He thrived in a position where his voice alone dictated the physical output of others, and that very habit of coldly directing the physical labor of others while remaining completely exempt from the effort would come back to define his entire domestic existence. During these early years, his arrogance was just the standard irritating trait of a brilliant young student. Everything is still relatively okay. He graduates from Oxford, moves to Cambridge to begin his doctoral research in cosmology, and prepares to conquer the academic world. Then, in 1962, the foundation cracked. The universe he was trying to map in his mind was mathematically perfect, but his own biology began a terrifying, silent rebellion. It started with minor, almost imperceptible betrayals. He would stumble on a perfectly flat pavement. He would drop a glass of water because his grip inexplicably loosened. His famously sharp tongue would occasionally produce words that were thick and slurred, as if he had been drinking heavily in the middle of the day. For a man whose entire identity was built on absolute control and superiority, these physical failures were deeply humiliating. He tried to hide them. He refused to acknowledge the clumsiness, aggressively shutting down anyone who dared to ask if he was feeling well. But the body cannot be outsmarted by the brain. In early 1963, shortly after his 21st birthday, the undeniable physical deterioration forced him into a sterile, cold hospital room for 2 weeks of agonizing tests. They injected dye into his spine. They attached electrodes to his decaying muscles. And then the doctors delivered a verdict that was entirely devoid of hope. Motor neuron disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. They explained the mechanics of his impending doom with clinical precision. The disease would systematically hunt down and destroy the nerves that controlled his voluntary muscles. He would lose the ability to walk, to hold a pen, to swallow, and eventually to breathe. But the cruelest aspect of this specific disease, the psychological torture that would define the rest of his life, was that his brain would remain completely untouched. His intellect, his sensory nerves, his ability to feel pain, and his awareness would stay perfectly intact while his body slowly turned into a suffocating tomb. They gave him roughly 2 years to live. The sheer suffocating terror of that timeline was absolute. He was 21 years old. He was a man who believed he was destined to unlock the secrets of the cosmos, suddenly told that he would be dead before he even finished his thesis. This is the critical moment of psychological fracture. This is the birth of his hamartia, his fatal flaw. Faced with the absolute abyss of powerlessness, Hawking retreated into a dark depression. He locked himself in his Cambridge room, drank heavily, and listened to the heavy, tragic operas of Richard Wagner. He was staring down a future where he would be entirely dependent on the pity of others. For a man of his towering pride, being pitied was worse than dying. He realized that if he was going to survive this death sentence, he could not simply be smart. He had to be dominant. He made a silent, desperate vow that he would never allow the world to see him as a weak, pathetic victim. He would use his mind as an impenetrable shield. He would command his environment with such absolute intellectual authority that no one would dare look down on him. He needed a physical bridge to the outside world, an extension of his failing limbs. Right as the shadows of his diagnosis were at their darkest, he found Jane Wilde at a New Year's Eve party. Jane Wilde was young, empathetic, and captivated by his eccentric brilliance. She saw the tragic, terrifying reality of his illness, but she was drawn to his stubborn, fierce refusal to surrender. She did not realize that by stepping into his world, she was not just offering love, she was volunteering for a grueling, decades-long shift of uncompensated, exhausting physical labor. She was about to become the coxswain's crew, pulling the oars while he steered the boat. The wedding photographs from July 1965 offer a deeply haunting visual. Stephen Hawking stands next to Jane Wilde, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his frame already beginning to warp under the invisible weight of his collapsing nervous system. They smile, presenting a united front of defiant romance. But a wedding ring does not halt a degenerative disease. The moment the cameras stopped flashing and the door of their Cambridge home closed, the brutal, unrelenting physics of their domestic reality took hold. Her marriage swiftly devolved into a lifelong contract of severe, unpaid, and unacknowledged physical labor. She became the living scaffolding for a man whose mind was expanding into the cosmos, while his body was rapidly turning to stone. As the late 1960s bled into the 1970s, the grim mechanics of motor neuron disease stripped away his physical independence with terrifying speed. He lost the ability to walk. He lost the ability to write out the complex mathematical equations that were currently revolutionizing theoretical physics. Eventually, he lost the ability to feed himself. The physical manifestation of this decline fell entirely onto Jane. The stark daily reality of the household fell entirely on Jane. A slight woman, she was forced to physically lift a grown man out of bed. She had to bathe him, dress him, and painstakingly cut his food into tiny, manageable pieces before feeding him, spoonful by spoonful. She was acting as an extension of his own severed nervous system. Hawking's management of his diagnosis was dictated by his terror of being seen as an invalid. This led to a household policy of aggressive denial, where for years he flatly refused any outside professional help. He viewed the presence of nurses as a glaring, humiliating admission of his own powerlessness. So, he banned them. He demanded that the facade of a perfectly normal, independent family be maintained at all costs, and the entire cost of that impossible facade was paid in the currency of his wife's physical and mental exhaustion. He gaslit the reality of his own dying body. If he refused to acknowledge his helplessness, then in his mind he was still the undisputed independent patriarch. Jane was forced to absorb the massive shock wave of his denial. She was drowning under the weight of his care, raising their growing family and dealing with a husband who would retreat into stubborn, icy silence whenever she attempted to discuss the unsustainable reality of their lives. He used his silence as a weapon of ultimate control. When Jane begged for assistance, he would simply close his eyes, let his head loll forward, and refuse to engage. He was mapping the origins of time itself, yet he demonstrated a staggering, willful ignorance of the time he was stealing from the woman keeping him alive. The intellectual inequality within the home was equally oppressive, cultivated by his demand to be the absolute center of gravity. Jane was a formidable intellect in her own right, holding a deep passion for medieval Spanish poetry and pursuing her own doctorate. But within the walls of the Hawking residence, her academic ambitions were treated as a quaint, invisible hobby. His pursuit of physics was treated as monumental. Her pursuit of literature was a minor distraction that could only be attended to once his feeding, bathing, and mobility needs were completely satisfied. The power dynamic was ruthlessly clear. He was the sun, and she was merely a satellite trapped entirely in his orbit, burning up upon re-entry every single day. By the late 1970s, Hawking had achieved academic superstardom within the physics community. He had proven that black holes emit radiation, a groundbreaking discovery that cemented his status as a once-in-a-generation genius. He was traveling the globe, attending elite conferences, and receiving prestigious awards. Yet these trips carried a staggering contradiction. Behind the podium, behind the applause of the world's greatest scientists, was Jane. She was packing his bags, managing his specialized diet, wrestling his increasingly heavy wheelchair onto international flights, and serving as his sole desperate interpreter. His natural voice had deteriorated into a thick, slurred, agonizing sequence of grunts. Strangers could not understand a word he said. Jane had to lean in close, listen to the distorted sounds, and translate his brilliant theories to the waiting world. She was the vital bridge between his isolated brain and humanity. This extreme dependency forced a deeply uncomfortable, claustrophobic intimacy. He needed her to survive, and he resented her for it. His inherent resentment toward any witnesses of his vulnerability ultimately shattered his family structure. He became increasingly demanding, punishing her for the very help he required. The atmosphere in the house grew toxic, saturated with his unspoken anger at his physical state and his ruthless determination to project superiority. As the 1980s dawned, the family had grown to include 3 children, Robert, Lucy, and Tim. But the arrival of children did not soften his tyranny. It merely expanded his workforce. The children, particularly his eldest son Robert, were inevitably drafted into the grueling routine of their father's care. They grew up in a household where the emotional and physical needs of a single man entirely suffocated the oxygen in the room. They learned early on that their father's genius exempted him from the normal rules of parenting. Rather than a nurturing parent, he functioned purely as an immovable monument that required constant, terrifying maintenance. The children watched their mother slowly break under the strain, aging prematurely under the relentless demands of a man who refused to compromise. Jane was entirely isolated, emotionally starved, and physically broken. Seeking a desperate sliver of personal identity outside of being Stephen Hawking's nurse, she joined a local church choir. It was there she met Jonathan Hellyer-Jones, a local musician. Jonathan was everything Stephen was not: physically capable, deeply empathetic, and entirely unimpressed by the ruthless competition of Cambridge academia. Jane and Jonathan formed a close emotional bond, but the way Stephen Hawking reacted to this relationship reveals the chilling, transactional nature of his mind. Hawking did not react with fiery jealousy or demand a divorce. He did something far more calculating. He analyzed the situation and realized that Jonathan possessed physical strength. He realized that if Jonathan was integrated into the household, Jonathan could carry him up the stairs. Jonathan could lift him in and out of the car. Jonathan could relieve the physical burden on Jane, ensuring that she wouldn't completely collapse and leave Stephen without his primary caregiver. So, the great genius tacitly allowed the man who was falling in love with his wife to become a permanent fixture in their home. He swallowed his pride not out of love for Jane, but out of a cold, pragmatic need for survival. He tolerated his wife's emotional escape as long as it provided him with a free, physically capable servant. It was the ultimate exercise in emotional manipulation. In the summer of 1985, the fragile, deeply compromised ecosystem of the Cambridge household violently collapsed. For over 2 decades, the arrangement of duty, resentment, and survival was punishing, but it functioned. Then, during a research trip to Geneva, Switzerland, Hawking's decaying body finally hit a wall he could not intellectually outmaneuver. He contracted a severe case of pneumonia. For a healthy man, pneumonia is dangerous. For a man whose chest muscles were already profoundly paralyzed by motor neuron disease, it was a catastrophic, immediate death sentence. He fell into a deep coma. He was placed on a ventilator in a sterile Swiss intensive care unit, his brilliant mind trapped inside a biological shell that was rapidly shutting down. The medical staff, looking at the flatlining prospects of recovery and the already ravaged state of his body, approached Jane Wilde with a grim clinical proposition. They offered to turn off the life support machines. They offered her a legal, medically sanctioned exit from the 20-year nightmare of physical exhaustion. Jane stood in that humming hospital room, holding the absolute, undisputed power of life and death over the man who had dominated her existence. She refused to pull the plug. She demanded he be flown back to England for continued treatment. She chose to save his life. But the brutal irony of this decision is that by saving his life, she inadvertently authorized a medical procedure that would permanently destroy the last remaining intimate bond of their marriage. To bypass the blocked airways and allow a machine to breathe for him, the surgeons had to perform a tracheotomy. The surgical blade pierced his windpipe, circumventing his vocal cords entirely. He survived the infection, and he woke up from the coma. But when he tried to speak, there was nothing. He was completely, profoundly, and permanently mute. The man whose theories spanned the infinite edges of the universe could no longer make a single biological sound to ask for a glass of water. It was the ultimate terrifying realization of his fatal weakness, the absolute loss of physical agency. For the first few agonizing months following the operation, he communicated through a spelling board. He would raise his eyebrows slightly when an assistant pointed to the correct letter on a card, slowly, painstakingly spelling out words. It was a torturous, humiliating process that pushed his frustration to dangerous heights. He was a towering intellect trapped in a game of charades, entirely dependent on the patience of whoever was holding the card. The physical manifestation of his psychological terror was evident in his eyes, a fierce, trapped panic of a man who realized he was entirely at the mercy of others. And then a technological intervention occurred that would alter the course of modern history. A computer programmer in California had developed an early, rudimentary speech program. To get this program to work for Hawking, an exceptional Cambridge engineer was brought in to adapt the hardware. This engineer painstakingly mounted a small computer onto the heavy wheelchair. He rigged a delicate, highly sensitive switch that Hawking could operate with the remaining millimeters of movement in his thumb. By twitching his thumb, Hawking could select words from a screen and send them to a speech synthesizer. Suddenly, a robotic, metallic, vaguely American accented voice filled the room. The famous voice of Stephen Hawking was born. This machine triggered a profound psychological shift. To the public, it was a triumph of technology over disability. But inside the home, it was a devastating domestic earthquake. Before the tracheotomy, Hawking's natural speech had been a thick, slurred, agonizing sequence of grunts that only one person on Earth could reliably understand: Jane. She was his sole, irreplaceable interpreter. That extreme dependency forced a begrudging, unbreakable intimacy. They were tethered together by a secret language. But the moment the speech synthesizer booted up, that tether was violently severed. He no longer needed Jane to translate his thoughts to the world. The machine spoke for him with absolute unfeeling clarity. The computerized voice gave him an impenetrable psychological shield. A synthesized voice carries no emotion, no vulnerability, no waver of hesitation. It sounds exactly like an oracle. He could use it to deliver the most biting, cruel dismissals to his wife, and it would sound like a statement of objective scientific fact. He was fully liberated from his dependence on Jane's voice, and armed with this new, terrifying independence, he threw his entire intellect into his writing. In 1988, he published A Brief History of Time. The impact was a cultural detonation. It was not just a science book, it became an unprecedented global phenomenon. It remained on the Sunday Times bestseller list for a staggering 237 weeks. The obscure, difficult Cambridge physicist was instantly transformed into an international superstar. Wealth poured in by the millions. Television crews camped outside his door. World leaders requested private audiences. He was no longer just a brilliant academic. He had become a secular deity. This sudden, massive influx of power, wealth, and uncritical adoration radically mutated his environment. The royalties from the book allowed him to completely restructure his care. He no longer relied solely on Jane and a patchwork of friends. He hired a rotating 24-hour staff of highly paid professional nurses. The family home was transformed into a sterile, crowded medical clinic. But the power dynamic with these nurses was fundamentally different. They did not see the stubborn, difficult man who had ruthlessly refused help for 20 years. They did not see the husband who had ground his wife into physical exhaustion. They only saw the great man. They saw the legend. The physical manifestations of his inflated ego became impossible to ignore. He began to demand center stage in every room he entered. He developed a notorious habit of weaponizing his heavy, motorized wheelchair. He would deliberately, aggressively drive over the toes of people he disliked or who dared to disagree with him in academic debates. A petty physical tyranny executed by a paralyzed man who knew he could not be hit back. He learned to use his severe disability as an absolute defense against any form of accountability. The gap between how the public perceived him and how he operated behind closed doors widened into a chasm. The public saw an inspiring, tragic figure. His family saw a man drunk on his own mythology. He craved an echo chamber. He wanted an environment where he was never challenged, never reminded of his past vulnerabilities, and forever worshipped as the undisputed center of gravity. Jane, exhausted and deeply anchored in the gritty reality of his illness, could not provide this worship. She saw the man, not the myth, but the rotating staff of nurses were eager to please, eager to be close to absolute power, and more than willing to treat him as infallible. Stephen Hawking had realized that his intellect and his fame were currencies he could use to purchase absolute compliance. He was looking for someone who would not just care for his body, but who would aggressively feed his massive ego and protect his status as a deity. Among the phalanx of medical professionals hired to monitor his fragile breathing, there was one particular nurse who recognized this deep psychological hunger immediately. She knew exactly how to manipulate the power vacuum left by his fractured marriage. And the plot twist regarding her true identity and the man she was married to at the time sets the stage for a betrayal so ruthless it exposes the absolute darkest corners of Hawking's character. The name of the nurse who recognized this profound power vacuum was Elaine Mason. When she arrived at the Hawking residence in the late 1980s, she did not merely step into a vacant medical role. She stepped directly into the psychological wreckage of a collapsing marriage. By this time, Jane Wilde was physically and emotionally hollowed out. She looked at Stephen and saw the grinding, exhausting reality of the past 25 years. The difficult, stubbornly proud, and frequently selfish man she had carried, fed, and bathed. Jane could not offer him the uncritical worship he now believed he deserved, because she remembered the days when he was terrified, unknown, and utterly dependent. Elaine, however, looked at the wheelchair and saw the icon. She saw the global superstar, the wealthy author, the center of the universe. And she made absolutely certain that Stephen knew it. Elaine was brash, fiercely territorial, and offered an intoxicating, obsessive brand of devotion that fed directly into his most fatal weakness. A layer of irony so deep and a betrayal so callous bordered on the grotesque. The sheer brazen cruelty of this chapter lies entirely in the identity of Elaine's husband. At the time she began nursing Stephen, Elaine was married to a man named David Mason. David was not just a bystander in this story. He was an exceptionally talented engineer based in Cambridge. When Hawking lost his natural voice entirely to the tracheotomy in 1985, it was David Mason who stepped into the void to engineer his salvation. David took the early, clunky American software program known as Equalizer and painstakingly adapted it for a severely paralyzed man. David Mason invested staggering, uncompensated physical labor. He spent countless hours in the Hawking home designing the bespoke hardware, mounting the heavy computer monitor securely to the armrest of the wheelchair, and intricately rigging the delicate, highly sensitive thumb switch that allowed Hawking to select words from the screen. David Mason gave Stephen Hawking his iconic voice. He handed the great genius the very technological weapon he needed to reclaim his absolute power over the world and launch his book to global supremacy. And how did Stephen Hawking repay the man who rescued him from total suffocating silence? He used that exact machine to systematically seduce his wife. The issue here is not simply that a difficult marriage finally collapsed under the relentless strain of chronic illness. Marriages break every day under far less pressure. The issue is the staggering lack of basic human empathy, the sheer ruthless calculation displayed by a man celebrated for his profound understanding of existence. While David Mason was wiring the circuits, soldering the connections, and writing the code that kept Hawking connected to humanity, Hawking was actively dismantling Mason's family from the inside. He would sit in his customized chair, using the voice David built, to flirt with Elaine, to command Elaine, and eventually to secure her absolute loyalty. It is a terrifying testament to his core psychological flaw. His need for absolute control and uncritical worship completely overrode any sense of gratitude, loyalty, or basic moral obligation. He took what he wanted because decades of surviving his own decaying body had taught him that his genius exempted him from the rules of ordinary men. Inside the Cambridge house, the atmosphere turned aggressively toxic. An affair for a man with advanced motor neuron disease is not an affair of secret hotel rooms and physical trysts. It is an affair of the mind, played out right in the open, directly in front of the exhausted wife. It is a psychological severing. The physical manifestations of this betrayal were painfully visible in the daily routine of the household. Elaine began to act not just as a medical professional, but as a fiercely jealous, heavily armed gatekeeper. She physically placed herself between Stephen and his family. If Jane entered the room to speak to her husband, Elaine would hover aggressively, her hand resting territorially on the back of his wheelchair. She would lean down and whisper in his ear, creating a closed, impenetrable loop of intimacy that explicitly excluded his wife. Stephen, for his part, entirely encouraged this dynamic. He weaponized Elaine's fierce combative devotion to punish Jane for her independence. When Jane tried to maintain household boundaries or demanded that he engage with the children rather than just his nurses, he would simply shut his eyes. Or worse, he would instruct Elaine to wheel him away. The speech synthesizer, the mechanical voice that the entire world hung on for the secrets of the cosmos, was used at home to deliver cold, clipped, devastating dismissals to the woman who had sacrificed her youth to keep his heart beating. He had successfully outsourced his cruelty. He did not have to raise a finger to dismiss Jane. He just had to let his new nurse physically push her out of the way. The breaking point arrived with cold, calculated precision. The breaking point was a sterile, devastating execution of power, completely devoid of any fiery argument. In February 1990, just weeks after the Christmas holidays, the facade was officially torn down. Stephen Hawking announced he was leaving his family home. The visual of this departure is incredibly stark and deeply unnatural. There was no fiery argument or chaotic packing. He simply sat perfectly motionless in his motorized chair, issuing commands via a twitch of his thumb, while paid staff boxed up his life of 25 years. He rolled out of the front door of the home Jane had maintained for 25 years, moving directly into a new expensive flat with Elaine Mason. He took the global fame, the massive book royalties, the international adoration, and the technological voice, leaving Jane with the hollow, exhausting echo of the last 3 decades. To discard a spouse who has served as a caregiver is one thing, but the chilling depth of Hawking's detachment was fully realized in how he subsequently treated his 3 children, Robert, Lucy, and Tim. These were the children who had grown up terrified of his coughing fits, who had watched him nearly die multiple times, and who had warped their entire childhoods around his suffocating, immovable needs. Following the separation, Hawking erected a massive, impenetrable wall of silence between himself and his own blood. For years, his children struggled to even get a response from him. Why did the great communicator, the man who wrote books explaining the universe to the common man, refuse to communicate with his own sons and daughter? Because to speak to them was to acknowledge the wreckage he had caused. It was far easier to simply erase them from his daily equations. And more importantly, Elaine was now in total, undisputed control of the communication apparatus. She screened the phone calls. She managed the guest list. She controlled exactly who was allowed into his physical presence. The children found themselves systematically alienated, unable to bypass the aggressive security perimeter established by the new woman in his life. Hawking allowed this to happen. He traded the complex, demanding reality of a family for a sterile echo chamber. He chose a world where he was never challenged, never reminded of his past vulnerabilities, and forever worshipped as the undisputed center of gravity. The public, entirely blind to the domestic slaughter taking place in Cambridge, simply adjusted the myth to fit their comfort level. The global media spun the separation as the inevitable tragic consequence of a terrible illness. Jane was quietly pushed to the margins of the story, written off by the press as a woman who simply couldn't handle the heroic pressure anymore. Meanwhile, Stephen and Elaine were photographed smiling together, the brilliant, tragic genius and his devoted, loving new companion. The world applauded. Hawking had executed a ruthless personal coup, destroyed 2 families, and suffered absolutely 0 public consequences. His fame acted as an impenetrable shield against any moral scrutiny. By the mid-1990s, Hawking had achieved exactly what he had always wanted. He had escaped the woman who knew him when he was weak and terrified. He had secured a partner whose entire identity and financial security were entirely dependent on his power and status. He was rich, globally revered, and completely insulated from criticism. He believed he had engineered the perfect life, a fortress of absolute control where his massive intellect and his fragile ego would be permanently protected by Elaine's aggressive territorial devotion. But this is the fundamental tragedy of choosing a sycophant over an equal partner. When you hand someone the keys to your survival simply because they feed your ego, you hand them the absolute power to destroy you. Hawking believed he had moved into a sanctuary of endless adoration. He did not realize he had just rolled his wheelchair straight into a trap. For years, his fatal weakness, his desperate need for control, and his refusal to appear vulnerable had ruined the lives of others. But as the 1990s wore on, the very control he sought was about to be turned violently, physically, against him. The doors of the new flat were about to lock from the inside. The man who unlocked the deepest secrets of the universe was about to discover what a true, inescapable black hole really looks like, and the chilling reality of what happens when the abuser becomes the abused. The marriage of Stephen Hawking and Elaine Mason in September 1995 was a masterclass in public relations and a triumph of carefully curated optics. The press photographs taken outside the registry office in Cambridge depict a scene of victorious, heartwarming romance. Hawking, dressed sharply in a dark suit, sits elevated in his motorized wheelchair, a slight smile playing on his lips. Standing directly behind him is Elaine, wearing a white dress, beaming with the fierce protective pride of a savior. The global media eagerly consumed the narrative. They painted Elaine as the dedicated, endlessly loyal nurse who had stepped into the breach to heal the broken heart of a neglected, tragic genius. It was the perfect, uplifting story of redemption that society desperately wanted to believe. But a photograph only captures a fraction of a second. It does not capture the suffocating, heavy silence that fell over the house once the flash bulbs stopped popping, the cameras left, and the heavy front door locked from the inside. Within the walls of that house, the power dynamics shifted with a speed and a viciousness that was terrifying to witness. Stephen Hawking had abandoned his first wife because he demanded an environment of total uncritical control. He wanted an ecosystem where his authority was absolute and his genius was worshipped without the irritating friction of a shared history. He genuinely believed he was the master of his new domain, but he had gravely miscalculated the complex predatory psychology of his new bride. Elaine's ambition extended far beyond nursing a global icon. She sought total ownership of the man. The very physical dependency that Hawking was so desperately trying to hide from the world became the exact precise weapon Elaine used to systematically dominate him. The customized wheelchair, which had once represented his liberation and his technological triumph, was rapidly becoming his personal cage. The first casualty of this new authoritarian regime was his remaining connection to the outside world. To fully control a powerful man, an abuser must first isolate him, cutting off his supply lines to objective reality. Testimonies from former staff described a systematic, aggressive campaign by Elaine to sever his ties with his past. His 3 children, Robert, Lucy, and Tim, who were already deeply wounded by the brutal nature of the separation, found it almost impossible to see their own father. When his daughter Lucy attempted to visit the house, she was routinely blocked at the door by nursing staff operating under strict orders. If she did manage to get inside the living room, Elaine would sit in the corner, intensely monitoring every single word exchanged. She created an atmosphere so thick with hostility and unspoken threats that the visits became agonizingly brief and utterly devoid of genuine connection. Former academic colleagues, brilliant physicists, and old friends who had known Stephen before the global fame were quietly and ruthlessly scrubbed from the guest list. The house became an impenetrable fortress, and Elaine was the sole, heavily armed gatekeeper. Even the rotating staff of specialized nurses, the highly trained medical professionals hired specifically to keep Hawking alive, were subjected to an environment of intense paranoia and psychological intimidation. If a nurse questioned Elaine's unorthodox medical methods, or worse, if a nurse showed too much warmth, empathy, or friendly rapport toward Stephen, they were swiftly and mercilessly fired. The staff lived in constant, palpable fear of crossing the new Mrs. Hawking. But the most chilling, heartbreaking aspect of this total isolation was that Stephen Hawking actively allowed it to happen. His fatal weakness had entirely paralyzed his judgment. His desperate, clawing need to maintain the illusion of a perfect, highly functional life prevented him from speaking out. He chose to abandon his own flesh and blood rather than admit to the world that he had made a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. He was terrified of the public humiliation, the tabloid mockery, and the academic pity that would inevitably come from a second failed marriage. So he stayed silent, and that silence was the ultimate green light for the nightmare to escalate from psychological manipulation to sheer, visceral physical brutality. By the early 2000s, rumors from the Cambridge house crystallized into reports of severe physical trauma. Hospital records from Addenbrooke's Hospital and testimonies from former nurses indicated Hawking was regularly arriving at emergency rooms with severe injuries. The medical explanations provided by Elaine to the attending physicians were highly scrutinized and often contradicted basic physical mechanics. On one notable occasion, Hawking was brought into the trauma ward with a severely fractured wrist. The official explanation logged by his wife was that he had fallen from his wheelchair. However, basic physical mechanics render such an accident virtually impossible. The precise condition of Stephen Hawking in the early 2000s meant he was securely strapped into a heavy, custom-engineered, highly stable, low center of gravity motorized wheelchair. He was completely immobile and weighed less than 100 pounds. For a man in his specific paralyzed condition to spontaneously fall and snap his wrist bone with such blunt force required a violent, external, kinetic intervention. It required him to be physically thrown, but the broken wrist was merely a baseline for the violence. The injuries escalated with sickening, predictable regularity. Nurses reported arriving for their morning shifts to find the great professor with deep, jagged cuts across his face and neck. On one horrific occasion, a terrified nurse found him with a massive bleeding gash completely severing his upper lip. Another time, he suffered mysterious heavy bruising around both of his eyes, classic violent black eyes that Elaine casually and aggressively dismissed as the result of his head simply bumping against the plastic casing of his computer screen. The sheer physical indignity of the allegations is staggering. According to testimonies from terrified former nurses, a man whose towering intellect commanded the respect of world leaders was being battered and bloodied in his own bedroom. Yet perhaps the most chilling, sadistic incidents were those that deliberately exploited his absolute physical helplessness without leaving a bruise. Cruelty often bypasses the clenched fist, relying entirely on deliberate, calculated neglect. During the blistering heat of a Cambridge summer, an incident occurred that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying nature of his captivity. According to detailed sworn statements given by former staff to investigative journalists, Hawking was wheeled out into the back garden by his wife. He was placed directly under the blazing midday sun, and then he was simply left there. Unable to move his arms, steer his chair, or use his voice monitor, which had been purposefully turned off, he was left trapped in the heat-absorbing chair. By the time a junior nurse brought him inside, he was suffering from severe sunstroke with burned and blistering skin. Former staff alleged this was a calculated act of neglect. This pattern extended to other daily routines. Multiple independent sources reported an incident where he was allowed to slide beneath the surface of his bathwater. He swallowed water, choking and thrashing in his paralyzed state, his lungs filling with fluid, nearly drowning before being roughly pulled up. Other internal reports detailed how he was routinely denied access to his urine bottle, forced to soil himself in his chair for hours, a tactic designed purely to humiliate him, to break his spirit, and to strip away the last remnants of his towering pride. The continuation of this systematic abuse for years defies standard logic. Why didn't the highly trained nurses physically intervene? Why didn't someone pull the fire alarm on this domestic hell and call the authorities? The answer to that question reveals the darkest, most twisted, and most tragic contradiction of Stephen Hawking's entire life. The nurses did try. Multiple women who bathed him, fed him, bandaged his cuts, and witnessed the terrifying injuries approached him privately in moments when Elaine was out of the room. They begged him to let them call the police. They offered to help him leave, to smuggle him out of the house. And every single time, Hawking used his famous synthesized voice to immediately shut them down. He fiercely, aggressively, and stubbornly defended his abuser. He told his staff that he was just clumsy. He insisted the horrifying injuries were minor accidents. He threatened to immediately fire and ruin the career of anyone who spoke to the press or the local authorities. The great genius had become entirely inextricably complicit in his own physical destruction. His hamartia had fully consumed his logic. To admit that he was a victim of horrific domestic abuse was to admit that he was weak, pathetic, and entirely dependent. The very concepts he had spent 40 years proving, he had conquered. He would rather suffer the fractured bones, the torn lips, the suffocating heat stroke, and the near drownings than suffer the pity of the public. He was engaged in a massive pathological cover-up to protect the indestructible myth of Stephen Hawking. Elaine understood this psychology perfectly. She knew his massive pride was his Achilles heel. She knew he would never turn her in because to turn her in would destroy the flawless, untouchable image he worshipped far more than his own physical safety. But blood is a difficult thing to hide forever. The sheer volume of the injuries, the frequency of the hospital visits, and the severity of the trauma meant that the secret could no longer be contained within the thick brick walls of the Cambridge house. The medical staff at Addenbrooke's hospital were growing deeply suspicious and legally concerned. The fired nurses, carrying the heavy psychological trauma of what they had witnessed, were quietly speaking to investigative journalists at Vanity Fair and the British tabloids. His children, desperate, alienated, and terrified for their father's life, were pushing hard for legal intervention from the outside. The dam was finally cracking. The whisper network had grown too loud to ignore, and in the early months of 2004, the private bloody nightmare finally collided with public law enforcement. The Cambridge Police Department officially opened a criminal investigation into the systemic physical abuse of Britain's most treasured and famous scientist. Detectives prepared to enter the fortress. They had compiled the medical files. They had the witness statements. They had the motive. They were ready to dismantle the cycle of abuse, arrest the perpetrator, and rescue the victim. But to secure a conviction, the police needed one crucial, undeniable piece of evidence. They needed the victim to speak the truth. And this is where the plot twisted into a masterclass of psychological manipulation and tragic stubbornness. When the detectives finally crossed the threshold and sat down in the living room, they were not prepared for what was about to happen. The issue wasn't just whether Hawking was being abused. The issue was what happens when the smartest man on earth decides to use his towering genius not to seek justice, but to actively outsmart the police, deliberately protecting the very hands that were breaking his bones. When the detectives from the Cambridge Police Department finally sat down in Stephen Hawking's living room in the summer of 2004, they believed they were holding an airtight case. They had amassed a thick, horrifying dossier. They had the sterile, undeniable medical records detailing the unexplained fractures, the severe lacerations, and the sunstroke. They possessed sworn, tearful statements from multiple highly trained former nurses who had witnessed the terrifying, suffocating control Elaine Mason exerted over the household. The police did not come to investigate a mystery. They came to execute a rescue mission. All they needed was for the victim to confirm what the physical evidence already proved beyond a reasonable doubt. They sat across from the motionless genius, watching the subtle twitch of his cheek muscle, waiting for the electronic voice to finally break the silence, point the finger at his abuser, and end the nightmare. Then came a devastating, agonizing psychological turn. Hawking did not use his towering intellect to assist the police. He used it to completely outmaneuver them. He actively buried the investigation to protect the very woman who was systematically tearing him apart. When directly questioned about the injuries by the detectives, the famous synthesized voice delivered a cold, calculated, and absolute denial. He categorically refused to make a complaint. He stated on the official police record that he was entirely happy with his wife. He insisted that the horrifying allegations of abuse were the malicious, coordinated fabrications of disgruntled, incompetent former employees. He went a step further, threatening aggressive legal action against any press outlet that dared to suggest he was a victim. The detectives were paralyzed. In the eyes of the British legal system, you cannot prosecute a domestic abuser if the victim, possessing a fully competent, brilliant, and legally sound mind, looks you in the eye and insists that no crime has occurred. The police had the weapon, they had the blood, and they had the motive, but they had been entirely checkmated by the victim himself. The paradox is glaring. The smartest man on the planet actively chose to remain in a burning house, locking the doors from the inside. The answer lies in his fatal weakness. Hawking's entire identity, his global mythos, and his psychological survival were built on the premise of absolute, untouchable invincibility. He was the man who conquered a death sentence. To admit to the Cambridge police that he was a battered husband, to allow the tabloids to print sensational stories of him being left out in the sun to bake or having his wheelchair controls taken away so he couldn't escape, that would completely shatter the monument he had spent 40 years building. It would reduce him from a scientific deity to a pathetic, helpless, pitied victim. His pride was so massive, so unyielding, that he willingly chose visceral physical torture over public humiliation. He chose the private hell of his own home over the patronizing pity of the world. The immediate consequences of this decision were catastrophic. By surviving the police investigation, Elaine's power within the household became absolute. She had stared down the law and won, backed entirely by the genius himself. The nurses, who had bravely spoken out to the authorities, were banished, their careers damaged. The house went into total suffocating lockdown. But the human mind, no matter how brilliant or suppressed, cannot exist in a state of constant, suffocating fear without seeking a release valve. If Hawking could no longer find power, respect, or agency within the walls of his own home, he was determined to purchase it somewhere else. This is the moment the story moves out of the sterile, terrifying domestic sphere of Cambridge and descends into the neon-lit, morally ambiguous shadows of London. The public image of Stephen Hawking during these years was that of a pure, saint-like mind. Society viewed him as a brain floating in a jar, entirely divorced from the messy, carnal, and biological realities of the human body. Nothing could be further from the truth. The paralysis of his muscles did not paralyze his neurochemistry. He possessed intense, ordinary, earthly desires, and the total suppression of his physical agency by his wife only made those desires sharper, darker, and more desperate. To cope with the prison of his daily life, Hawking began to frequent an environment that represented the absolute polar opposite of his Cambridge home. He became a regular, highly enthusiastic patron of some of London's most notorious gentlemen's clubs, most famously Peter Stringfellow's strip club in Soho. The visual contrast was almost cinematic in its absurdity. The thumping, heavy bass of early 2000s club music vibrated against the walls. Dim, hazy red lighting cut through the chaotic, highly sexualized energy of the London nightlife. And there, sitting perfectly still in a private, roped-off VIP corner, flanked by a nervous medical entourage, was the author of A Brief History of Time. He was not there as a curious tourist or an academic observer. He was a recognized, highly valued regular, Peter Stringfellow, the late flamboyant owner of the club, went on the public record detailing his interactions with the professor. Stringfellow recalled a night when he approached the dark VIP area, knelt beside the famous wheelchair, and asked somewhat awkwardly if the professor wanted to spend the evening discussing the mysteries of the universe or the concept of deep time. Hawking's response, meticulously typed out with the twitch of his cheek and delivered through his robotic voice, was perfectly blunt. The girls. He would sit in those private booths for hours, entirely motionless, watching the exotic dancers perform exclusively for him. To the outside observer, it might simply look like the eccentric, slightly tragic behavior of an aging, disabled man seeking a cheap thrill. Stripped of its glamour, however, this was a desperate, fascinating power play. In his home, he was abused, manipulated, and treated as a heavy physical burden. But in the VIP room of a strip club, the dynamic was entirely reversed. A strip club is an environment built purely on transactional power. In that dark room, his paralyzed body did not matter. What mattered was his fame, his immense wealth, and his VIP status. The women dancing for him were not nurses forcing him to take his medicine, nor were they an angry wife withholding his basic needs or physical dignity. They were performers who were highly paid to cater to his gaze, to treat him as a powerful, desirable man. For a few hours a night, his money bought him the illusion of total physical agency. He could not touch, but he could command the attention of the entire room. He was the undisputed, untouchable king of that dark corner. It was a grotesque, tragic compromise, purchasing the illusion of power in a Soho basement because he had surrendered all actual power in his own living room. This behavior reveals a crucial, dangerous shift in his moral boundaries. Hawking was becoming increasingly comfortable operating in insulated VIP environments where the normal rules of society simply did not apply to him. He was learning that his immense fame and his severe disability acted as a dual, impenetrable shield. He could engage in highly controversial, morally gray behavior, and the public would either completely look the other way or excuse it as the harmless eccentricities of a tragic genius. The strip clubs were legally permitted, albeit unseemly for a man of his towering academic standing. But this growing addiction to exclusive, consequence-free zones, this hunger to be treated as an untouchable VIP away from the prying eyes of his ruined family, was laying the psychological groundwork for a catastrophic misstep. He was becoming dangerously comfortable in the company of men who operated entirely in the shadows. He enjoyed the deference of club owners and wealthy patrons who asked no questions and provided him with whatever earthly distractions he demanded. This slow, steady erosion of his moral compass, this willingness to trade his ethical standing for a few hours of transactional worship, was about to pull him out of the neon lights of London. It was about to place him on a private, customized submarine, floating through the crystal clear waters of the Caribbean. And waiting for him on the beach, ready to fund his next grand escape, was a man whose very name would soon become synonymous with the darkest, most vile criminal enterprise of the 21st century. The genius had learned to love the shadows, but he was about to step onto an island entirely consumed by the dark. In March 2006, a highly exclusive scientific conference took place on the idyllic Caribbean island of St. Thomas. The official agenda was a dense, highly technical exploration of gravity, black holes, and the foundational laws of theoretical physics. Some of the greatest minds on the planet were flown in to debate the nature of the cosmos. But the underlying gravity of this specific event was distinctly financial and deeply sinister. The entire conference, the private flights, the luxury accommodations, the lavish entertainment, and the staggering logistics was heavily funded by one man, Jeffrey Epstein. For Stephen Hawking, this was not simply a professional obligation or a standard academic retreat. It was a highly curated VIP escape. The flight logs from Epstein's private jet, the aircraft infamously dubbed the Lolita Express by the media, show Hawking's name clearly listed among the passengers. But the academic conference on the respectable neighboring island of St. Thomas was merely the front door. The real story, the devastating moral failure that shatters the myth of his saintly character, occurred a short boat ride away, directly on the grounds of Epstein's private sanctuary, Little St. James. Leaked photographs and archival records place Hawking directly on Little St. James. One photograph shows him attending a casual barbecue on the island, an environment now known as the epicenter of a horrific human trafficking ring. He enjoyed the exclusive atmosphere while entirely surrounded by an infrastructure built specifically for exploitation. His presence at a barbecue hosted by a prolific predator was driven directly by his fatal weakness. Hawking's entire adult life was defined by an aggressive, desperate need to deny his own physical limitations. He craved experiences that made him feel powerful, exceptional, and totally unhindered by his decaying biology. He was addicted to access. Jeffrey Epstein was a master manipulator who dealt explicitly in human weaknesses. Epstein did not offer Hawking scientific insight. He offered him the ultimate untouchable VIP treatment. Epstein collected brilliant minds like trophies. He used the presence of Nobel laureates and world-famous scientists to launder his own dark reputation, using their towering credibility to shield his criminal enterprise. He knew exactly what currency to use to purchase Hawking's presence. He offered him an environment where his genius was worshipped, his physical needs were catered to with limitless wealth, and his ego was constantly massaged. Epstein even funded a highly specialized, incredibly expensive excursion just to prove his devotion to the genius. He paid to have a custom submarine retrofitted specifically to accommodate the massive weight and dimensions of Hawking's wheelchair. This allowed the paralyzed professor to be lowered beneath the waves, experiencing a private, weightless tour of the ocean floor. It was an engineering marvel, but it was also a profound psychological transaction. Hawking, blinded by his own ego and his insatiable hunger for exclusive experiences, eagerly accepted the invitation. He wanted the submarine ride. He wanted to feel the thrill of defying his paralysis. And in exchange for that thrill, he allowed his towering, unimpeachable reputation to be used as a shield of respectability for a monster. There has never been any public evidence or criminal accusation suggesting that Stephen Hawking actively participated in the sexual abuses on Little St. James. The issue is the staggering, deliberate moral blindness he exercised simply by being there. The devastating irony lies in the absolute hypocrisy. A mind capable of fathoming the infinite chose to look the other way, dining on an island built on human exploitation. He traded the hard-won moral weight of his name to provide a shield of respectability for an enclave funded by a man later exposed as a prolific predator, entirely for the sake of luxury and untouchable VIP access. He understood the complex, invisible forces that hold distant galaxies together, but he demonstrated a spectacular, willful ignorance of the basic moral forces that hold human decency together. This was not a naive mistake made by a sheltered academic. This was a calculated transaction. He sold his presence, his face, and his credibility to a trafficker to maintain his lifestyle of untouchable privilege. He had spent years in the VIP corners of Soho strip clubs, learning to love the shadows, learning to accept the deferential treatment of men who operated outside the law. Little St. James was simply the logical conclusion of a moral compass that had been spinning out of control for a decade. He believed his genius gave him a pass. He believed he could float above the filth. But this pattern of moral compromise eventually mirrored the quiet collapse of his personal life. In 2006, the very same year he visited Epstein's Island, the walls of the Cambridge fortress finally buckled. The years of unacknowledged physical abuse, the terrifying police investigations, and the sheer toxicity of the household reached a breaking point. There was no explosive trial. The fortress simply dissolved in silence. Elaine Mason quietly filed for divorce. The gatekeeper was gone. Physically shattered and morally compromised, the great genius was left entirely alone. With his echo chamber dismantled, Hawking was forced to return to the very family he had ruthlessly discarded. Jane and his children returned to his side, not out of worship, but out of profound human pity. The media framed it as a heartwarming reconciliation, but the reality was stark. A paralyzed man who had finally run out of sycophants had nowhere else to go. When Stephen Hawking died in March 2018, society buried a monument in Westminster Abbey. The world mourned a secular saint, willfully erasing the messy reality of his existence. He mapped the event horizons of dying stars with absolute precision, yet he could never escape the black hole of his own character. When the equations are erased and the applause fades, there are no untouchable saints. There is only the unvarnished truth.